area of America kind of at odds with a different area of America. Sometimes at odd is not that big a difference. It's just like taxes or tariffs, you know, if you go back to the 1830s. But this sectional difference is going to lead us to secession. So that's important. Now, keep in mind, that is not a new concept. New York had considered secession with Aaron Burr, okay, all the way back in the early 1800s. The Hartford Convention during the War of 1812 discusses secession as a concept. But we had hoped that through the compromise of the 1820s and the victory of the War of 1812, that wouldn't really be the case. But what usually has been the most sectional division issue has been the spread of slavery, and that will be the case this time as well. So let's get into the election of 1848. Before I ask you any other questions, let me just go ahead and ask you a question from page 381 in the top of my guide. What is a panacea? So one of my concerns about reading an AP textbook is, I will remind you, the vast majority of Americans read on a 7th grade level. That's why you don't know what a panacea is. Now, you may not be on a 7th grade level, but I want you to read at a collegiate level. You see the difference? More importantly, the good colleges are going to demand that you read at that level. So if you're at UVA, you better be able to read at a collegiate level. A panacea, if you look on here, it says the popular sovereignty panacea. Very hard to get a contextual clue out of that, isn't it? And see, this is my concern, is that you guys, if you don't know it in context, you just skim over it. That sound familiar territory? That's missing a learning opportunity. That's failing to grow. And if you guys think you're done learning already, then you are woeful prepared for college. Because the whole idea is that you are a lifelong learner. You understand? I am trying to prepare you to be lifelong. We got to have some people do it. Yes, I know many people are stuck in the 7th or 8th grade mindset, but some people need to be beyond that, particularly if we're going to have an educated society. Anybody figure out what a panacea is? It's a cure-all. It's a wonder drug. It's a solution for every problem. So if the title of the section is the popular sovereignty panacea, that should tell you that whoever or whatever group thinks that that works, thinks it's going to solve the problem. In this case, the problem is slavery, or the spread thereof. So when you see the word panacea in the reading, maybe on a quiz next time, the bonus will be, what's a panacea, right? Cure for what ails you. Not a vaccine, but a cure, right? So the problem was, as is often the case, in the 1840s, you had the emergence of two very, very vocal and very, very divided minorities. So what we notice about American history is that most of the time, what Richard Nixon would later deem the silent majority, most of the time, most people don't have much to say about much of anything. That's why Yamamoto said he feared he'd wakened a sleeping giant. Meaning the American people, as a rule, are sleepwalking through history. Because we're doing what? We're existing. We're on those 3 levels of the hierarchy of needs. We don't go to college. We don't take philosophy. We don't study history. We're just making it through, which means we don't want our routine and our day messed up, even if it means totally ignoring what the CDC tells us to do, right? So you had 2 groups who did not want to ignore the issue. The problem was they could not be more opposed to each other. You had abolitionists who wanted to do what to slavery? Get rid of it, abolish it. And then you had a group emerge in the South, particularly actually the Middle South, where you see a lot of them, Virginia and Tennessee of all places, who are called fire eaters. And the fire eaters believe that slavery shouldn't be stopped anywhere. Because to them, slavery is property, and the Constitution guarantees your right to property. So they want to put the mute button on the abolitionists. Now, ordinary Americans don't really want to talk about the issue at all. You understand? What's our typical behavior throughout all American history? It's not just American behavior, it's human behavior. How many of you guys or ladies have been ghosted in a relationship? Ghosting is just another version of what? The silent treatment, meaning if I don't pay attention to them, hopefully they'll get the message and go away. Yes, that is a very typical human behavior. Ghosting, silent treatment, putting your head in the sand is another way of describing it, meaning like what animal is infamous for hiding from problems. The ostrich just buries its head in the sand and says, oh, I hope I don't get hurt, right? So America didn't really at all find itself like these two groups. Southerners weren't fire eaters, Northerners weren't abolitionists as a group, right? But who were the loudest? These two groups. So they got a lot of attention, just like people out in Portland were the loudest this summer, but they didn't reflect what most people feel. You understand? At least not to that extreme. So we're talking about extreme positions. Now, just because you're extreme doesn't mean you're wrong, but it just means you're outside what one political scientist calls the Overton window. The Overton window is the acceptable level of debate from here to here. And if you're outside of it, you're a nut. You understand? You're a radical. That's what the Overton window says. So these guys are radicals. So what seemed the best way to solve it? Well, that's this panacea called what? Popular sovereignty. So what is popular sovereignty? What does it mean? Well, first of all, we have to have an election. Who said he wasn't going to run for re-election? Oh, and he didn't. He died not long after it, okay? He worked himself to death. So you have three candidates. The Whigs have figured out what's the only way to win, apparently. Run a war hero. Very good. Run a general. Well, Cass was a war hero, but his war was the War of 1812, so he's a little bit old. Zachary Taylor's a hero of what war? The Mexican Wars. It's a little fresh in the minds of everybody. Problem with Cass, too, is that he had too much of a record. He'd been involved with Jackson's presidency, and he'd been the ambassador to France. And so Cass was kind of a well-known figure. From New Hampshire, but he spent most of his time in Ohio and Illinois. So he was well representative of the northern area, but he was what we would call a Northern Democrat who was soft on slavery. If you're a Democrat in America, you had to be soft on slavery. What does that mean? What are you going to be critical of? Right. You weren't going to make anti-slavery a position, even if you were a Northern Democrat, because you're going to be running for national office as a Northern Democrat opposed to slavery. You get that, right? So Cass was comfortable, apparently, with the spread of slavery. That then led to a new party. Now, they pulled out old Van Buren, which was probably a mistake, right? Because not necessarily a famous person, a popular person in American history, right? But Van Buren is nominated by a new political party. Now, it is different than the 1844 Liberty Party. This party is called the Free Soil Party, okay? And they run old Martin Van Buren. And the Free Soil Party viewed this way. I'll go ahead and give you what the Free Soils meant. The Free Soilers were made up of Democrats who were unhappy with the Southern Democrats' love of slavery. In other words, they were called barn burners. They were Northern Democrats who were willing to not support slavery. So they were not silent on that subject. So they're Free Soilers. But perhaps more importantly, they were people who didn't feel like the Abolitionist Party was ever going to get elected. See, this party was made up of white people who didn't want slavery to spread because they didn't want to have competition with it. Not necessarily because they were abolitionists. So some of them were abolitionists. But their uniform sort of single issue was the opposition of slavery's spread to the new territories. Which territories am I talking about? Missouri had already been accepted, but if you look above it, you see Iowa. If you look to the west of it, you see Kansas and Nebraska. So they don't want slavery to spread there. Okay? So no spread of slavery if you're a Free Soiler. Not necessarily because you're an abolitionist. Keep in mind, this party is not saying do away with slavery. Don't let it what? Spread. Okay? And so they run who is their hero? Van Buren, who's from New York City and obviously doesn't know what life on the frontier is like very much. Okay? So nonetheless, he was famous, so they ran him and he did all right. You can see. No electoral votes. But again, we see that the National Party comes down to, by the way, this is an election which basically it's because Taylor's a war hero. Taylor had never voted before, ever. All right, he didn't know anything about politics, right? So he was kind of like an X factor. You guys know what I mean by that? It's a variable. The Whigs did not come out clearly in favor of the spread of slavery or opposed to the spread of slavery. The Dems had come up with what idea? This is Lewis Cass's creation. Popular sovereignty. So you need to learn what this means. It means, well, this looks really vague, right? This is how it translates. People can vote. Well, that sounds like democracy, doesn't it? But how is that relevant to slavery? I mean, that seems democracy 101.
He's counting black people.
No, you're not talking about black voters.
The people in the states decide.
Not the word states, but you're getting real close.
National government?
The people in the territory decide before it becomes a state. Very good. So yes, you got the right idea. So Landon and Gabriel were saying the people in that area, in this case, a territory. So if Kansas votes to have slavery, should it have slavery? That's democracy, isn't it? That sounds like democracy. So as far as, this is why it's a cure-all. You just let the people there do what? Vote on it. And yeah, democratic, of course, if you're a free soiler, is that good enough? Because that could let the spread of slavery happen, couldn't it? If you're an abolitionist, is this even remotely good enough? But for your ordinary silent American, this seems like reasonable. If the people of Nebraska or Kansas want to vote to have slavery in their territory before they become a state, okay, seems reasonable. Well, that idea does not win. In other words, Cass does not win the election, obviously. But what can you see about the election? Look at the popular vote. Not that that always is relevant, but is America fairly closely divided, popularity-wise, right? And what about regionally? Not really divided either, right? Sectionally. So I know the chapter is called Sectionalism, but the election of 1848 is not a sectional election. Let that sink in. This election is not divided between North and South. You have a Northern Democrat and a Southern Whig. That's who gets elected. Taylor's from Louisiana.
Did you say the 2020 election was like sectional?
I would definitely say it was divided between rural and urban. Now, it's hard to say that's sectional because every state in America has some sort of rural and some sort of urban. The election of 2020 was like most elections in the last 50 years. Election of 2016 was the unusual one. Now the South has been slowly becoming less solidly South, particularly Georgia. Wow, I would never have called that. All right, but the left coast, as it's generally called, is going to almost always vote Democrat. I mean, this is solidly blue out here. It's that Rust Belt region in 2012 that changed to 2016. That was the unexpected change. All right, but no, I mean, it's not pure. I mean, it is to a large degree that, yes, it's a large degree rural and urban. But it's not entirely that, because there are urban environments that vote Republican to some degree, and there are rural environments. I like to think of it as suburban is a swing vote. So yeah, rural versus urban, and then what's the suburbs going to do? They're like the silent majority a lot of times. You understand? So the suburbs are kind of like, I'm not sure how people are going to feel. The soccer moms, and, they voted for Bush and Obama. So they're the swing voters, they sometimes call it. Okay. Well, this election has a lot of that too in it, I think. You have people here who are concerned about the fire eaters, but they also have people who are concerned about the abolitionists. Keep in mind, are most people fire eaters or abolitionists? No. Okay. So that's the key here, is that this election is not. Now, while Cass doesn't win, the idea starts to become very popular, particularly in which party? The Democratic Party. This is a cure-all for the Democrats, because Northern Democrats aren't particularly keen on the issue of slavery, right? But they're kind of ambivalent. You know that word, ambivalent? They don't really care. It's not their problem. But they need to come up with a solution that certainly sounds democratic. And boy, does that, right? If you took out the slavery narrative, this is democracy. I will emphasize this, folks. Democracy can vote away people's rights. That's what Madison warned about in Federalist 10, right? You can see your majority, tyrant, a mile away than 3,000 miles away. So in other words, allowing slavery to spread is a democratic value in principle under this concept. Got it? All right, so make sure you know the free soilers. Now, I would tell you, this probably could have lasted easily a decade if something completely unexpected hadn't happened. So what was completely unexpected? By the way, I think Trump lost this year because of the pandemic. I'm going to throw that out there. Something he did not respond to well and wasn't like, that was not on his radar. You know what I'm saying? Had it not happened, I think he gets reelected. People vote the economy, and the economy probably wouldn't have been in the toilet had it not been for the pandemic. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what people think about. So things, by and large, now I'm not saying that for certain, but I think a lot of those states that swung wouldn't have swung as much. Okay? So what happened that changed everything? Well, I'll give you a clue. It's 1849. Taylor's just been elected. California, that's right. So what gets discovered about the exact same time as the election is the biggest gold deposit in American history so far, all right? It's Sutter's Mill. This is where the word gets out that creates what is called the California Gold Rush. Now, of course, you should remember 1848 because of the German 48ers, right? German and Irish, but really, the year 48 isn't, and Seneca Falls Convention was also in 48. Lots of 48 stuff going on. But this thing is extraordinary. Look at all the gold mines, major gold mines, all the purple right there. So what was unknown and fresh out of our acquisition, boy, I bet the Mexicans are kicking themselves now, right? You know, like, well, I guess they didn't have a choice. But you get the idea, like, wow, they really lost out on 15 million, don't even begin to account for what California has to offer now. Because all those purple triangles, y'all, are where gold is found. So people are going to come pouring into California. I mean, pouring, as in like hundreds of thousands of people, right? And a lot of those people, you guys are fans of Toy Story? Prospector Pete, you know him? That's his name? Prospector, yeah. Stinky Pete. All right, sorry. The Prospector. He's got his little pickaxe. He's the villain, right? Yeah, not saying. Yeah. Well, Yosemite Sam. These are not necessarily like law-abiding dudes. These are some of the most like infamous people in history. A lot of these folks. So they come pouring into California with these not so law-abiding attitudes, right? They're jumping each other's claims. They're killing each other over gold dust. And the next thing you know, and by the way, a lot of them are going broke. A lot of them aren't getting anything. California sees an influx of Chinese people here to do their laundry. That's the first wave of Chinese immigrants come over here. They make more money. You see prostitutes making way more money than gold miners, right? So like all these people are pouring into California, like, oh my gosh. So what do? We want to be a state. They say, look at this. All these people have come here. We want to be a state. We have enough people already, thank you, California Gold Rush, to go from territory to what? Statehood. Now, normally it takes years for territories to get that many people, right? It took this one about 6 months. And the people that came, well, what do they need? They need some government. They need authority. They need, like, look at this. Hundreds, thousands of people are going to pour out here. So they're like, create a territorial governor. We need judges. We need courts. We want to be a state, right? If anything, to deal with all the lawlessness. Well, what's the problem? Yeah. You can definitely grow crops in California, can't you? Lots of crops. California's our biggest agricultural state. I know, right? It's hard to imagine. It's crazy, isn't it? All almonds and fruits. No, man. If you go out to Fresno or that area out there, no, man. California is. See, we have this image in our head that California's LA and California's Hollywood, right? But, I got a buddy who lived in Fresno area, and it was all almonds. Orange trees, groves everywhere, right? Tons and tons of agriculture. Okay? It's a huge agrarian state. So that creates a problem for us. Because every time we gain a new potential state, what do we have to add? Is there going to be slaves there? The debate over slavery. So, by the way, I do want to point out from your test, from your last quiz, some of you guys put, try to be very clear about the question about Polk that he had to complete once he took office. And you put Texas down. Texas was done before he took office. So it's Oregon and California, right? Well, here they are. And they're pretty much ready for statehood. That means we're going to have to resolve this problem. Okay, so here's the debates that are raging in America. This is where sectionalism is going to kick off. So California certainly helps kick it off. Okay, if California comes in, it is apparent by the sheer volume of people that what will California be? No, they don't bring slaves there. In other words, those hundreds of thousands of people that come in, even though it's an agricultural state, that's not what they're doing initially. What are they doing initially in California? Mining gold. Don't need slaves for that. And these aren't slaveholders that migrate out there. So by the time California has a population, they will be a free state, and they will be. So they're petitioning to be a free state, which will now make the Senate forever tilted in the favor of free states. You understand? This will give a free state advantage in the equal representation in the Senate. The House has long been advantage north, right? Population-wise. The House has always been sort of high population northern representative. Now, Texas had a funny looking boundary. What we think of Texas today isn't what Texas looks like. Let me see if I can go back and find it. This is Texas. The feds were saying, we're going to take a bunch of this. And when you look up there and you see what Texas looks like, you're like, oh, okay. But Texas didn't want to give this up. You see this kind of long stem that sticks way up? So the feds, the federal government, was talking about taking part of the border of Texas and putting it in with the other territory. They didn't think Texas should claim it. Texas is like, well, we want to claim it. This third issue is, and the one way to put it is, what doesn't naturally appear to going to exist in Arizona? What doesn't really make sense here, y'all? Slavery. Like, even if you allow slavery, nobody's probably going to need to bring slaves to Arizona. Why? It's a desert, not really a farming state, right? Although today you actually have agriculture because of irrigation. But if you didn't have irrigation in Nevada and Arizona and New Mexico, it's a desert. So nobody's going to bring, they're running out of slave states, and they know it, particularly the fire eaters know it. Right? Abolitionists are furious that slave auctions are held right outside the national capital in Washington, D.C. You can be a New England representative who's an abolitionist, come to Washington, D.C., your nation's capital, and there they're auctioning slaves. So the existence of the slave trade in D.C. And then lastly, the Underground Railroad has really stepped up its efforts. The Underground Railroad is bringing its A game, so to speak. And many northern states have begun to, not many, but a couple, Massachusetts notably, have begun to pass laws called personal liberty laws. What these are direct statement against slavery, saying if you get to our state, you are no longer a slave, which is in contradiction to the Constitution. So this is an act of nullification. You hear that? Northern cities and towns, we might call them sanctuary cities today, are saying we're not going to enforce a federal fugitive slave law. If runaway slaves get to our town, they're not slaves anymore. So they're called personal liberty laws. And so you have these 5 huge issues all going into the congressional election of 1850, midterm election. If I had to narrow it down, the least interesting to me is the Texas border dispute. But the rest are pretty concerning. Matters of slavery and where it will be and how it will be dealt with. So note these 5 issues, because these are going to be the issues resolved in an event called the Compromise of 1850. Now, because these Northerners were assisting runaway slaves and passing laws to make them not slaves, the fire eaters meet in a place called Nashville, which you're familiar with, and they actually say we should secede. And the cooler heads will prevail over them. In other words, they're not the big. But when we talk about 1860 secession, 1850, what are some Southerners talking about? That very issue. Now, the Supreme Court had actually weighed in on this, and it's a very famous case, not in your book apparently, but states do not have to spend their own money to do what? That is still true today. So when you hear about cities that are called sanctuary cities, like not enforcing federal immigration law, cities don't have to enforce federal law. That's not their function. Who has to enforce federal law? Federal government. Not the state or local government's job to protect the federal law, right? But you weren't supposed to interfere with runaways being recaptured. So because of the Constitution says that they're still property. There's an interesting period where you have people openly defying other states by freeing their, quote, property to becoming free people. And so the Southerners will ramp up their slave catchers profession, and the Underground Railroad will step up its job, particularly who? What famous underground conductor? Harriet Tubman. 300 people, remember? He's going to help lead. Now, some people look at 1850 and they say the South probably should have seceded then. Like, if you're considering when would have been a good time. The South would have been much better off probably seceding in 1850 than 1860. That decade of immigration, industrial growth for the North will make the difference. But the South had a lot of comparative advantages still at that point. They had a Southerner who was a slaveholder for president. Zachary Taylor was a plantation owner. They held a Southern cabinet, and the Supreme Court had a Southern Chief Justice, and most of them were appointed by Andrew Jackson. So Southern Court. So some people are saying that Republicans' days are numbered, but they've got enshrined 6 justices in the Supreme Court. Well, that's possible, but I doubt it. I think the pendulum swings back and forth. And this is one of those moments where the South was not losing, but they saw that perhaps they saw the writings on the wall. Like this would be the last time they will have equal representation in the Senate. And if they lose that, then it may be the last time they have a Southern president. And if they don't have a Southern president, then they don't have a Southern Supreme Court. You get the math, right? So in the calculus, this is sort of the best off they're going to get, they think. But this is still a pretty good place to be, if you're considering. So all of these seem to be advantages, although I would say that one of them is going to prove to be utterly illusory, being a big shock. Zachary Taylor. I'll tell you the story about how Zachary Taylor found out he was president. Zachary Taylor is like, I know he's a planner, but he's not like an FFD kind of planter. He was kind of like a earthy dude, right? So back in the day, when you got your mail, you had to go to the post office and get it. But most places didn't have like postmen to come and deliver stuff. Postman was like a clerk who sat in the store, and so they had what were called, if you didn't go, and by the way, you had to pay to get your mail. Like you had to pay the postage. So postage was forwarded. Like, if you wanted to get a mail, you paid for the postage. Like it was there. So a lot of people didn't pay for their mail, and they had what was called a dead letter office, like a place where mail just was discarded, basically. So Zachary Taylor didn't collect mail much. And so the letter notifying him that he'd been elected president was in the dead letter office. Like he didn't even bother checking it. A guy comes out to his plantation and says, hey, General Taylor, you've been elected president. They say Zachary Taylor looked him right in the eye and said, drink your whiskey. Meaning you must be stupid. You're wrong. But anyway, unqualified to be president, but there he is. Now here's Harriet Tubman again. Keep in mind that this lady she's taken on this legendary status at that time. People knew who she was. So don't forget that $1 million is maybe not totally true. Again, this seems to be a myth that to elevate her prestige. But regardless, there was clearly bounties out for her. And I point this out that I read this and I was like, man, that seems like a lot of money, But it seems like that was probably inflated as a form of propaganda. Like, hey, there's $1 million bounty on her. But regardless, there was a bounty for her. And she was somebody who people knew who she was. Certainly in the North, they knew who she was if they didn't know in the South. Okay. We talked about how the Underground Railroad operated. I think I said this in the previous section on slavery. Now, there is a question about how effective was the Underground Railroad. In reality, this goes back to those stats being funny things. In reality, there weren't that many runaways. You can see here, 1,000 out of 4 million people is not that many, right? What was typical more often was what we call manumission. To manumit, it's a verb, manumission, it's a verb to free one's slaves. So this is far more common. So in other words, freemen typically were free because of manumission, not because of runaway status. But you could also purchase your freedom as a result of saving money. I know it seems hard to believe, but I try to remind you that you can rent yourself out to like other people for your special skills. So like if you were a carpenter, so when you finish your day job, so to speak, at your plantation, you were allowed to rent yourself to someone else. Musical slaves would be rented for like parties, stuff like that. So this seems to have happened, kind of like a free agency almost. Not free, but agency. We'll go with that. All right. So I mentioned, and I'd like you to know it because I don't know if the book makes in depth about this at all. They had in 1850 a convention in Nashville, and this is a convention of Democrats, primarily fire eaters. You should know the Nashville Convention. Mississippi calls it the other slave states meet here. What are we going to do about California? So what they come up with initially is if California is a free state, then what are we going to do? That's right. But only Georgia and South Carolina voted in favor of that part of it. South Carolina. Always South Carolina. All right. So South Carolina and Georgia, because South Carolina starts the Civil War. So nonetheless, they don't vote in favor of secession here. They consider it, right? Like seriously, they consider seceding in 1850, but they vote it down. Now, the second group to meet actually says they have the right to secede, but they're not considered any kind of like authority. So what is clearly in the minds of young Southern radicals? Secession. Right, very good. So they're thinking it, even though the older kind of cooler heads prevailed in 1850. By 1860, who's going to be in charge of Southern places? The younger ones. The fire eaters are going to be in charge now. So you know, you can sense where this is going. All right, now this is when the immortal trio, as they're called, the American triumvirate. You guys remember the triumvirate in Rome? The immortal trio steps onto the stage for the last time. All three of these men will be dead within a year. Okay, a couple of years. So they've been with us since the 18 teens, particularly Webster and Clay and Calhoun, all three of them. They've been with us since, this was the second generation of American leadership that weren't president. All three of them wanted to be president.
Clay is still alive.
Yeah, they're all still alive. Like Clay, right, exactly. Webster is actually the healthiest of the three, Black Dan they call him. Calhoun is dying. I mean, he is in the midst of, I think he had tuberculosis at the time, but he's like, he can't even stand and speak anymore. Clay is not healthy either. But all three of these men have been pretty much with the country since the beginning, almost. Like they're the second generation of leaders. And they're going to be the ones who step in to the stage for 1850 and try to keep the nation together. You understand? And they're going to succeed. So it's these three guys who are kind of like, they represent each of the regions. Clay, the West, Henry Clay, the West. Calhoun, South Carolina, in the South. Webster, New England, right? So these three guys represent each region of their country. And I want to emphasize that all three of them do want to preserve the Union. Calhoun is often, pointed at his eyes, right? His eyes, they haunt you. But he's usually pointed at as like the architect of secession, and that's not true. I mean, he was absolutely a fervent Southern states rightist, but he did not argue for secession. That was not his, well, he wasn't a proponent of that. He wanted the South's sort of rights, freedoms, liberties, or whatever you want to call it, protected in whatever union, but he didn't advocate for disunion. All right, now what's going to happen though are these three guys are going to emerge as the new guard, the young gladiators. And so these are the new leadership group of the Senate. Now these are all senators, all six of these guys. On the left, you have the little giant, Stephen Douglas. Okay, Stephen Douglas will be, and I know he's not Southern, but he will be the guy who follows in Henry Clay's footsteps. He's from Illinois. Stephen Douglas will be a Democrat, play a Whig, but he's going to be the guy who's trying to represent multiple regions of the country. Then you're going to have this guy, Charles Sumner. But what I'm trying to tell you is these new senators are going to be different. Sumner is in favor of abolitionism. So that's new, right? And he's joined by William Seward, who's also in favor of abolition. So the Northern leadership, Douglas is ambivalent on the issue. He's from Illinois. He doesn't like white people, but he doesn't really like slavery either. So the new leadership, you can see, are, well, more radicalized, I guess you might say, particularly Sumner and Seward. Sumner and Seward are both from the old Conscience Whig, Free Soil, soon to be brand new Republican Party. Okay, so that's these two guys.
So which group was the ones that were the immortal trio during the Senate, like in the Senate?
They're all in the Senate, but these are the immortal trio in the Senate. These are the leaders. The immortal trio, the triumvirate, are these three guys: Clay, Calhoun, and Webster. They've been there since the 18 teens. They have a new group that are sometimes called the Young Guard, right, or the Young Gladiators, who are going to be strong in terms of their voice. I mean, we know them in history as opposed to random senators because they're going to be involved in debates. In other words, they're going to step into the vacuum that these guys lead. And they're going to be the next leadership class of the Senate. And you'll learn all three of them a lot. All right, so they're kind of like foreshadowing, I guess. Okay, now Henry Clay is going to rise in opposition to what's going on with the fire eaters and what's going on in Nashville. There are 5 bills. Actually, I take that back. There's one mega bill that's supposed to resolve all the 5 problems. We call this an omnibus bill in Congress, a bill that kind of has all the parts in it. And what Clay does, now here's where Clay's going to get in trouble. And actually Webster, that's Clay standing, but Webster gives a speech. So Webster's going to rise, and he's going to deliver a speech that's so famous, it's remembered by its date. So this is the 7th of March speech. Everybody see that up there? And what Webster does is he urges his colleagues, all the senators, to try to find a way to compromise. You understand? To try to find a way to preserve the Union. Now, the book points out, that's what I was checking. Webster, let's see here. The clamor for copies of his speech were mailed out. More than 100,000 and more than 200,000 wanted it. His efforts strengthened the Union sentiment, as especially pleasing to the banking and commercial centers of the North, which would lose millions if secession occurred. I want to point out, and here's several people sent him checks worth thousands of dollars, et cetera. But a lot of the abolitionists had believed Webster was one of theirs. They thought Webster was an abolitionist. Well, Webster hated slavery, but he loved America more. And so what is the 7th of March speech about? What key word? Got to find a way to compromise. We don't compromise. If the radicals get their way or the fire eaters get that way, it's going to split the Union. You understand? We're going to come up with a compromise. So Clay is the idea of it. Webster is the speaker of it. Calhoun, the best way to put it, is the not opponent of it, because what Calhoun proposes is a dual presidency. A president from the North and a president from the South. But that's not the same as secession. He's trying to come up with some solution to keep the South as a key part of the country in this debate of 1850. Now, remember Seward? He rises and says, there is a higher law than the Constitution, and makes a loud speech in favor of this higher law. What higher law is he referencing? No, not legal argument he's making. God's law. In other words, slavery is what? Immoral. It's God's law being violated. So Seward is like, we're not compromising. It's against whose law? So he makes this argument. Well, the question then is Seward going to win out? Because here's the deal. The bill is going to have to get past Zachary Taylor, who seems like he would support it, right? Well, it turns out Zachary Taylor is influenced by this speech. And by this guy, Seward. Higher law Seward, they call him. He'll later be Secretary of State Seward under President Lincoln. FYI. All right, but higher law Seward is so convincing he wins an appeal. And Taylor's like, I'm going to veto the bill. If you check out your presidential list sometimes, it's pretty cool because it literally has on there, death leads to passage of 1850 compromise. All right, so he was going to actually probably stop the bill. He supports, even though he's a slave holder, what is he not in favor of apparently? Not that part. The expansion of slavery. Like he wants to lay that issue to rest. No more expansion of slavery. So if there's no expansion of slavery, then the Southerners were out of here, right? So he goes and dedicates the Washington Monument. The Washington Monument, you know the one, famous? It's July 4th, 1850. And he's got a black suit on with tight collars, 4th of July, and he gives a speech, and he gets overheated. You know, he gets like sunstroke. So he goes back to the White House, and one of the delicacies of that day, like desserts of that day, was like what we would consider a milkshake. Ice was rare, right? So he drinks iced milk and cold cherries. He likes drinking a cherry milkshake, a bunch of it, and he waterlogged himself to death. His organs shut down. He went into like stroke, and he died of this, bilious fever and cholera morbus. We may recall, so far now we've had 2 presidents died of natural causes. It's easy to remember. Harrison got too cold and died. Taylor got too hot and died. All right, you know, so he drank his cherry milkshakes and that killed him. Yes, yeah, that is unfortunate. Right? It seems like a rough way to go, you know, like puking up milk and cherries. So yeah, that Taylor, old rough and ready, didn't make it. The good news is his VP is, well, not a strong figure. Good news for history, I guess. And his name is Millard Fillmore. And Millard Fillmore is very supportive of this bill. But here's the problem again. President Fillmore isn't the issue that's got to be dealt with, it's the Senate. So Clay and Webster by now are so not well, particularly Clay, that he hands off the compromise bill to Stephen Douglas. So Douglas becomes what we would now call the floor manager of the bill. And Douglas is smart dude, smart politician. He says, all right, we'll take the bill and we'll split it into 5 separate bills. Each bill being a separate law. And he gets different parts of the country to vote for each part so that all 5 pass. Is that smart? So we call it the Compromise of 1850 as if it were one law. But in fact, it's actually 5 separate laws that are rolled together by Stephen Douglas. So Clay created it, Webster gave the speech in favor of it, and Douglas delivered it. Taylor died to get out of the way of it. I mean, not on purpose. So, what will be the fate of California? It will be a free state. You do need to know all 5 parts of the Compromise of 1850. It's a big. All right? California will be a free state. The easiest way to phrase number 2 is popular sovereignty in the Mexican Cession. Now, the Mexican Cession has been split into 2 territories, Utah and New Mexico, which means, could slavery spread to these places? Yeah, it's possible. So, who's happy about number 1? Northerners. Who's happy about number 2? Number 3, Texas gets its boundary readjusted, but it does get some money for it. All right, so we give the federal government gives Texas $10 million for its boundary. I kind of consider that a Texas issue, you know, primarily. All right, no slave trade in D.C. Not an outright ban on slavery, but a slave trade ban. So no more auctions of slaves in the capital. Obviously, a win for who? For Northerners. And then you have the infamous number 5 fugitive slave law. The fugitive slave law of 1850 is one of the most unpopular laws in American history. Not in the South. They love it. But in the North, this is going to help convert people who weren't opposed to slavery per se into folks who are now not thrilled about it. Because this fugitive slave law makes it a crime if you do not help capture runaway slaves. So hear that part. A crime if you do not help. So if you don't testify, if you don't help form a posse, if you don't arrest people as a sheriff, it's a crime, which means overnight now everybody in the North is supposed to become slave catchers. And a lot of people were on the fence before, but now they're like, I don't like this law. So what do they start not doing, especially? They stop enforcing this. You see the biggest wave of nullification since the nullification crisis. Northern cities stopped following these laws completely. And you'll see the Underground Railroad actually step up operations. So if you're the South, you signed off on this thing thinking number 5 was your big win. And how did northern cities respond to it? They nullify it. So whenever I hear people talking about the Civil War being about states' rights, I'm like, that's crap. It's about a handful of states' right, quote unquote, to own slaves. That's not the same thing as the concept of states' rights. Because are these states that are ignoring this exercising their rights? Yeah, sure, in theory, right? So here you can see the geographic outcome of the compromise.
Can states still nullify laws today or no?
So guys at home, Gabriel asked me, can states still nullify laws today? So here's the answer, right? Now, what you said. And the answer to this question is states were never supposed to be able to nullify laws, first of all. Not how the Constitution works. But secondly, they do it all the time. Our state just passed a law legalizing marijuana, right? We're now one of 24. There's a federal law. Now, the House of Representatives just passed a law, the House side of Congress, to repeal this part of the Controlled Substance Act. There's a law that's been on the books since the 1970s that says marijuana is a Schedule I federal criminal act, like on the same scale as heroin. Okay? But half a dozen states have been defying that for over a decade now. So how does nullification work? It depends on who the president is. You understand? When southern states tried to nullify a tariff, what did Jackson do? He invaded it, or threatened to invade it, right? South Carolina. Okay? Nobody who nullified, no president arrested Northerners for nullification. You understand? But when Lincoln is in charge, will he accept the premise or theory that a state can secede? No. No, a state can, it's like having your hand leave your body, he says. Your hand can't just go away on its own, right? Buchanan, who's considered up until recently the worst president in American history, will not do anything to stop them from seceding. You understand? So it depends on what? Who the chief executive is, who the president is, right? Because they're the ones who are enforcing the nation's laws, not the Congress, not the Supreme Court. It's the president who has the power of the sword.
Oh, that's the what's the quote? All right, the Supreme Court has made it.
Yeah, Jackson quote. You know, Don Marshall has made a decision. Now let him enforce it because Marshall has no power of enforcement.
Yeah.
So nullification is going to be a response of this. You understand? But at the same time, it also pretty much clearly defines the boundaries of where, I mean, look at this map. Does this look like America now? With the exception of these two territories and what's left of the Louisiana Purchase, I mean, this looks like America. So the debate about slavery, in theory, has been what? Fixed, right? This is it. We're fixed. We're done. We're not going to have this debate anymore. So tomorrow, we'll discover that we are going to have this debate some more. Because one of these guys that I was just talking about out of this list really wants to be president, and he goes and screws the whole thing up. Okay? So we'll talk about that tomorrow. But I'm going to stop with that for today. Okay? Any questions at home? Any folks at home need anything answered or discussed or